Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to VulnCon 2024. We are here with Mr. Jay Jacobs to share with us his presentation on seeing the vulnerable forest through the exploited trees. I'm looking forward to this one. It's going to be interesting. A few announcements before we get started. Session surveys are available in the conference mobile app. Cell phones, keep them off or step outside if you got to make a call. These sessions are live. They're live streaming. So if you have questions at that point, raise your hand. I'll come around, give you the mic so you can ask the questions. If you're watching this virtually, just go ahead and post it to the Room 6 chat in Discord, and I'll be monitoring that and ask the questions for you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jay. Thanks. Jay.
Thank you. Check. All right. That's working, right? I have to have it kind of close. All right. All right. Well, I'm just going to jump into it. So just for a quick background on who I am, one of the things that I do that you may be familiar with is that I run the EPSS SIG group, and I'm the lead author, data scientist behind EPSS. And I'll be talking tomorrow about EPSS, so I'm not going to focus a whole lot on EPSS here. And what I do for a day job is I produce all of these. I work for a company called Cyentia, and we work with vendors to go through their data and publish reports. And so across the top, we worked with Kenna to do 9 prioritization to prediction reports, and those are all about vulnerabilities. If you haven't seen them, there's a lot of material in there, and they're available for download. Done a lot with Veracode on the state of software security, a lot of open source work, and a lot of stuff there, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I worked at Verizon for 4 years doing the data breach investigations report, and wrote a book called Data-Driven Security, which I think is 10 years old now. I think this year it's 10 years old. So I don't feel bad if you haven't heard of it. It's okay. So this talk is not about EPSS, but it is about the data behind EPSS. What is EPSS built on? Because there is a lot of exploitation activity in the wild that EPSS is built on, and that's all this talk is going to focus on. And that data comes from these companies. So mainly we've got Fortinet, Shadow Server, Alien Vault, Gray Noise, and F5 with Flux behind F5 and their data. And then Cisco and Cyentia does some other data for EPSS, but largely those are the companies donating their exploitation activity that they record. And the exploitation activity is basically some type of sensor picking up an exploitation attempt. Not that it was successful, not that it was targeting a vulnerable system. And it might be honeypots, might be an IDS or IPS system, could be any number of different devices or techniques. But I think all of them are network-based. So they're looking at the wire right now. We're trying to expand that to get other samples, more on hosts, more in malware, things like that. But for the most part, we're talking about network-based events. And if there's any questions, just jump in. So all of this, all the research I'm going to talk about is basically on 2 columns of data. So the first column is a CVE ID, and the second column is a date. So for the CVEs, we've got about 13,266, give or take, CVEs with exploitation activity. And then we've got over 2,830 days between basically the last 8 years or so. And so the combination of that, and what that means is like on this date for this CVE, that means there was exploitation activity recorded. And it might have been one event, might have been 100,000 different signatures hitting, might have been across multiple sources or just one source. That's all it's saying is that this CVE saw exploitation activity on this day. And that combination of these 2 columns goes for 8.1 million rows. And that's how much data this whole talk is about. I'll bring a bunch of other data in, but this is the core stuff that we're going to look at. And this is the agenda, and I don't expect you to read this right now. We're going to go through all of these questions one by one, and they're framed essentially like a research question. And I really like this quote. I think it's really appropriate to start out with, because one of the things that I've learned about working with data is that it's very humbling, right? I work with data. I have all these preconceived notions in mind. This is how things are exploited. This is how security works. This is how this is going to happen. And then you look at the data and the data humbles you because it's something totally different. And this is a quote attributed to Mark Twain, but it goes back further before Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so, right? That people come to these things. Working in security is really challenging. You don't have time to dig into everything. So you form these assumptions and these opinions about what's happening in especially exploitation activity. And that's what we're going to try and dig into. So I just want people to be aware of that quote. So how many CVEs are exploited in the wild? And this is sort of a foundation setting, right? Just to level set, how many are we talking about? When we did the first kind of report, and what was it, 2017, I think we had 1.2% of CVEs at that time. We had exploitation activity. Now we're talking a little bit more. So this is just a raw count, the date and how many CVEs we saw exploited. So we started over on the left here, 2016, and we start collecting data. So we had nothing and we started collecting and it jumps up. And then since then, relatively steady rise. We get some bumps and valleys and pits, but relatively steady rise. At the same time, I really like this plot. These are the cumulative count of published CVEs. And I didn't realize how steady this is. Like normally you see these split up by months or years or something. They're sort of going like this, jumping all over. But when you plot them like a cumulative thing, you see a little jump here. And I think this is a data thing right now in the data repositories, but largely it's a smooth line. And you can see the slope is going up, right? Everybody knows that we're seeing more and more CVEs, and that's what this plot is showing, just a relatively steady climb going up there. So given the previous one, these are how many CVEs that we've seen with exploitation activity. These are how many CVEs. This is the proportion of CVEs during that time that we saw exploitation activity for. So in this data set, roughly 4.5 to 5.5%, depending on the slice, depending on when you want to look at it. And we're going to go through a whole bunch of different slices, but this is largely what we're seeing. So if you're looking at a research report or somebody's talking about exploitation activity, you want to know how many CVEs they're looking at, how many of those are exploited, right? And this is a good benchmark sort of thing to say, is it 2%? Is it 4%? Are you getting above 6%? What are you seeing, right? Just to level set, this is where we're starting out from. All right, the next question, which vendors with more than 200 CVEs, because if you get lower, you get some small sample things, have the highest proportion of their CVEs exploited in the wild? Did anyone want to take a guess? Microsoft? It is Advantech. So basically what this is saying is, Microsoft is third, by the way. It's a great guess. It's a pretty obvious guess. Adobe is second. What this is saying, so like Advantech, I think has 296 published CVEs. Out of that 296, we saw exploitation activity on 101 of them, which is what, 34%? That's a really small screen. 34% of everything that they published has seen exploitation activity. And then if you look at, let's say, Microsoft, it's 3,092 CVEs out of the 11,212 that they have published, which is a lot more exploited CVEs, but as a proportion, that's going to be about 27%, right? And the plot is titled Efficiency Remediating by Vendor. So essentially, like, you might want to know this because maybe you want to go after Microsoft, right? You've got a whole bunch of Microsoft stuff. Let's prioritize them. Out of all those CVEs, about 27% are being exploited. So you would put in the effort to go after, say, 11,000, but you'd only get about 3,100 being only. You'd get a lot, 3,100 CVEs being exploited. And then you get down, you know, the dashed line here is the average. So like you get here, here's Apple just below average. They're at 366 out of 7,000. And so it's less efficient. When you get down here, the bottom one is Huawei. In our data, we have 2 out of 1,800. So it's less efficient to go after some of the other vendors, right? That's going to be a challenge. And so this is, I'm going through this one a little bit quick, but there's different ways that we're going to look at this. So efficiency is one way that we're going to look at it, right? Now, another thing we actually want to know is what is the best indicator of exploitation activity? So given that CVE, we can bring in a whole bunch of other data and find out what is associated with the most exploitation activity. And we're going to stick with this concept of efficiency. So like, let's start out with CWEs. You can see like the CWE 119, I think, do people know their CWEs off the top of their head? No? It's memory corruption. And I only know that because I memorized 119. I don't know the second one. But that is, 18%. So if you go back, Microsoft was, what was it, 27%? Now we're down on efficiency to 18% if you just do it by CWE. And CWE is really tricky because it's a hierarchical system. So like you might have 119 as memory corruption, and then under 119 might be heap state, a heap-based buffer overflow. And then you might have something next to it about a stack-based, but so like you get all these different CWEs. So that's why you get this weird, it's less efficient because they're sort of spread out and nested. And then you also get like the CWE other, meaning that it was a CWE not in the NVD view of the CWEs. So NVD put an other tag on there. And then you get not defined, meaning it didn't exist. And then not enough info, which is, there's quite a bit, 27,000 CVEs that don't have enough information published with them to assign a CWE. And so this is one thing we could look at to try and figure out how do we predict, how do we go after exploitation activity? We could also look at tags. So this is a tagging system that I developed to try and look at descriptions and other texts talking about vulnerabilities and what are they talking about? What is the vulnerability actually about? And so what this does is use a technique to pull up multi-word expressions. And so if it's talking about, the first one is crafted document, and that is 24% of things that talk about a crafted document are being exploited. Uninitialized memory corruption, crafted web, probably a crafted web page or web document or something. And you see all of those are more efficient. You can see code execution is up there, buffer overflow. Down on the bottom, you get things like physical, crafted certificate, HTML injection, privilege escalation is quite low for how many are talking about it. And so this is one way we can talk about what are the variables. And there's so many ways to look at this data. Another way is with CVSS, but CVSS has a challenge that we've been through multiple versions. And actually this is from, you can see it sort of cuts off 2022. This continues on, and V2 now is not being scored, and we just have V3.1 being scored, and so there's another area to that chart that I haven't updated. What if we just look at the CVE and what version of CVSS they have scored on there? Things with just the 2.0, which of course is the blue part over here, more of those are being exploited as a proportion, which essentially means that we're seeing exploitation activity for older vulns, right? And then you get down here, you see like the 2.0, 3.1, and just the 3.1, which you don't see in the top chart, we're seeing it less efficient. Some of the newer stuff we're not seeing some of the exploitation for. We can break that out by the vector. We can look at the actual tags in there. So you see like attack complexity high is the most efficient, and you're getting 616 out of the 9,500. And then you go down to attack complexity low, wherever that is, here. And it comes over to 3.9%. So we've got a different line here because we're only looking at 3.1 or 3.0, 3.1 scored things. But essentially we were at 5,600 out of 143,000 with attack complexity low. It's less efficient than attack complexity high, but of course you're only getting 616 versus the 5,600. So we want to, try and figure these things out. What can tell us, what are these telling us about this? Now, what if we looked at coverage, right? If we wanted to try and identify, there's 13,000 CVEs that were seen exploited. What if we want to identify those, right? We want the coverage of what's actually being exploited. At the very top, you get remote code execution, the top two, right? Remotely exploitable with code execution. If you do those two, you get pretty good coverage. You're getting 62% of this published CVEs are talking about remotely exploitable, somehow remotely. The second one, code execution, is 46%, right? Way above the average. And that makes sense. Obviously, we know that RCEs are generally a bigger deal than non-RCEs. And then you get some of the weird, CWEs in the bottom, Cisco, IBM down there. But I think the top is where a lot of the interesting stuff is. And you see a lot of the CVSS vectors up on top too. And these are all things that I'm feeding into EPSS, by the way, all of these variables. Now, we can take these two variables, this coverage and efficiency, right? If we focus on something, how efficient, what proportion of those are being exploited? And then the other side is coverage. If we look at one of these variables and try to go after those, how much of the things exploited will that fix, right? And that's what the coverage is talking about. How much of the things exploited are we going to prioritize? So we can put these on a plot. And what this plot is saying is that left to right, we've got coverage. So like in this chart right here, which is just the vendors, we have 0% coverage and we want to be at 100% coverage. Obviously, there's no one vendor that covers 100% of things being exploited. So most of the vendors, individual vendors, are way over on the left. And then you get some that are more efficient. And then here we're talking about the tags. This is going to be remote code execution, remote and code execution. They're high coverage, but they're less efficiency. And so efficiency is going to go this way. So if you just focused on that, you're not going to get them all. But you can see the top two for CWE and CVSS, generally lower efficiency, and we're sort of hovering in that lower left. Now, if we did this perfectly, we'd be in the upper right, right? If we knew which 13,000 were being exploited, we could just go after those, would be in the upper right. This is what it looks like on a single chart. So you get Microsoft sticking out sort of in between here, and Adobe and Advantech up here with the higher efficiency, but still very low coverage because there's a small number of CVEs. And then you get code execution and remotely exploitable. You get all the CVSS things in the red here, and then some smatterings down in the corner. Now I'm going to bring in some other variables and see where they fit on this plot. Now we're bringing in sort of the intel type things, right? If something is in Metasploit, it's that higher dot to the right. About 75–80% of the modules in Metasploit have seen exploitation activity in this data. So if something is in there, and the other thing that's interesting, that's where Metasploit is. Kev is down below there. So it's less efficient and less coverage. So if you want to go after something, Metasploit is actually better in these two metrics than Kev, right? It's crazy to me to look at this stuff and have the data correct my way of thinking. We also see intrigue, and some of these are essentially scanners or offensive security tools. We see nuclei in there. Here's exploit.db right here. Here's Trend Micro ZDI if it's listed on that website. GitHub hosting exploit code. So they're doing better. So like just exploit.db, you're going to be better than a lot of the individual variables down here, but still, not going into the upper right like we want. So a lot of these threat intel things, they're sort of low volume, but high efficiency. Now, I'm going to put on another plot that's like this, but I'm going to modify it slightly. You guys see the difference on this one? So this is all the vulnerabilities exploited. And then I just isolated those exploited in January of this year. We can see that things are shifting down, things are shifting over, which means out of everything we've seen exploited, not all of them were exploited in January. And this is starting to get to an interesting research question about if something's exploited, is it always exploited? But what we want to focus on here now is to look at this. So what I did in this chart is I grabbed EPSS. So EPSS publishes these scores every day. And then with the benefit of hindsight, so like this is, I can't remember, April 7th or something, 2021. This is version 1 of EPSS. It's a continuous score. So like if you decided to go 9.9 and above, actually 0.9 is that first emptied point up there. And then 0.8, 0.7, 0.6, so on and so forth. And this is like 0.1 right here. And you create a line because it's a continuous number. It's not a yes or no, it's a continuous number. So you create a line. And so if you remember all those points are sort of hovering down on the left, and then they go up on the left. And if we start this as an actual animation, this is every day I'm creating this and I'm looking at the line. We're going to see this line dip because of some data collection problems. We see a dip and then we go to V2. Here's EPSS V2. We're trying to push into that upper right here. And that's what we're trying to do. And you see V2, it's jumping around. We're sort of hovering about that same ability. And then we're going to introduce V3. This is EPSS V3 trying to push that coverage and efficiency, trying to get in the upper right, that upper right area. And this is all based on those variables we were talking about, right? EPSS takes all of those variables, puts them into models, tries to figure out what is the most information it can extract out of there. And I put these lines and the thresholds just to show some of the increase. Like here's 0.1 and V1. And if we go to 0.1 and V2, we get a huge increase in coverage. And then in V3, we get an increase in coverage and efficiency, and so on and so forth for the different thresholds. Now, one of the interesting things, I haven't talked about CVSS, but this is what CVSS looks like. It's not made to predict exploitation activity. This is not what CVSS was designed for. But if you wanted to try and stop exploitation activity, here's CVSS 10, here's 9.9, here's 9 and above. So these are all the critical ones, right? So, and this circle is the amount of effort. So I think by the time you get to 7, you're doing 50, well, Yota was like 57%. 57% of published CVEs are 7 and above. So you got this big circle over half, and you're 83% coverage by doing that, but only like 5% efficiency. Meaning if you did 7 and above, you're going to remediate 4 to 5 things being exploited, but for every 20 that you remediate, only 1 of those are going to be actually exploited. So you're not being very efficient, right? And you can see in EPSS the different thresholds here and where they hit. And you see the relative size of the circle. So you're getting about the same level of coverage here for at least a third in the effort as far as efficiency and coverage. So the answer to the question about the best indicator with a very biased answer is EPSS. This is a question I brought up, true or false, once exploited, always exploited, right? And I brought this up on LinkedIn, had a very healthy discussion, and the general answer was yes, right? When we think something is exploited, it's probably always going to be exploited. And so to try and answer that, I'm going to try and answer it in a whole bunch of different ways. This is basically the same chart looking at how many unique CVEs are we seeing. And the red shows annually. So like back from 2016 to 17, at the start of the data, we saw 4,700 unique. 2017, we saw 5,600, so on and so forth. In 2023, we saw 10,000 unique CVEs exploited during that whole 12-month period. The blue are individual months. So you can see we got some data collection problems. Don't want to hide these. These are part of real life, right? Anybody who's worked with data knows that sometimes you drop data on the floor, right? And that's what these are. These are sort of drop data on the floor. And those are things you have to work around in real life. But you see they're hovering, they're getting up to about 8,000 per month. So in any given month, we're seeing about 8,000. But remember, there are 13,000 total CVEs with exploitation activity. Yet last year, we only saw 10,000 of those. So clearly things were exploited and they're no longer being exploited. So I asked the question, when was the last exploitation activity observed? And I pulled out some interesting stats. So this is saying, you know, like in this quarter, in the beginning of 2024, which only went up through like mid-February, there was 56% of those 13,000 were seen exploited in that time. And this quarter, 14%, the last time that they were seen exploited was in this quarter, so on and so forth. But this is the cumulative. And so what this is saying, if we go back a year, about 24% of the CVEs that we've seen exploitation before were seen before a year ago. The last time we saw them, 1 in 4 of those vulnerabilities have not been exploited in the last 12 months. And so the question is, which 1 in 4? You know, we get things like these lists of vulnerabilities saying this is being exploited in the wild, but a month later, we want to know, is it still being exploited? What about next year? You know, we're putting in hardware and new things all the time, reinstalling images, and we see things that are old, new vulnerabilities pop up that are old vulnerabilities. And should we prioritize those over the new ones? This is another way to look at that. Couple of interesting things. First, this is very square. You see a lot of lines going horizontally, a lot of things going vertically. And then you see white spaces, which where we have some data collection problems. And this is organized, sorted by what I titled it a scene ratio. And what it is, these are only the CVEs that were exploited before a year ago. And then the scene ratio counts up how many days since it was first seen until today, what proportion of days during that time. So if it was published a year ago and we saw 180 days out of the 365, it'd have like 50% scene ratio. Now, some of those CVEs are at the top, 100%. We've seen it exploited every single day since it came out. Those exist. Those are out there. Those are probably what we think of when we think of exploitation activity, because they're the noisiest. They're probably the ones in the headlines. They're the big ones we care about. Below that, it drops off pretty quick, right? At 75%, and I think the next chart goes into it. Before I move on, though, I want to talk about this big white space here. So like, and what's interesting is because I sorted them, I don't know if you guys can see this, but there's a little line doing this, just like really subtle. These are CVEs that were exploited for 1 day, right? And because this was exploited longer than that, the scene ratio is a little bit lower on the bottom one. So we get these lines being formed because this was exploited once, these were exploited twice, and these are 3 times. And so we get these lines forming in the way that this data was organized. But the scene ratio in like the bottom here is less than 1%, right? And what that means is that there's very, very little exploitation activity captured on a lot of those, on at least 1 out of 4. So this is showing that scene ratio, and I put some words in there. About 25% of CVEs are seen roughly less than 1 in 72 out of all of the days. And that doesn't mean like every 72 days we saw exploitation activity, because if we remember, we have these vertical spikes. Those are sort of clusters of exploitation. We see very bursty data about exploitation activity. It doesn't sort of tick along. It sort of goes wham, and then it dies down. Then it might pop up again, but it's very bursty. And so on and so forth here. So like at 50% of the CVEs are seen roughly less than 1 in 5 of the days that they could be seen after they're seen in the first time. And again, there was that big stripe across the top. There's supposed to be circles on this, so I'm just going to describe it. And I put this on LinkedIn. It's really a shame this didn't come through. They're really pretty plot. But what this is trying to show is if we looked at Kev, there's a Kev circle here on the left that has 364 and 623. And then there's this giant circle of all of our exploitation activity. And what this is saying is that There were 12,362 CVEs being exploited that are not on the KEV. There are 623 that are on the KEV that we saw exploited, and this is on September 1st. There are 364 CVEs on the KEV that we did not see exploitation activity for. And then this is all time. And then if we just look at September 1st, which is here, it actually drops. So even though it was added to the KEV and we saw 623, now just in September, we saw 532. So there were 91 CVEs on the KEV where we did not see any more exploitation activity. And if there are questions, just jump in. All right, here's another question. Once something is exploited in the wild, how quickly should it spread? Right? And the thinking I think here is like, it's exploited in the wild. We have hours, minutes, days, weeks. How long until it spreads across the internet? How quick do we have to respond to that? And this was a study, this was part of the Kenna series that we did. And this just focused on 2019 CVEs. And it was specifically, I think, in Fortinet data because they had organizations and device IDs. So we could see which device IDs saw which CVEs. And they have over 100,000 devices worldwide and their installation. So really, really good coverage of this. And if you notice, this is a density plot. And so about 3/4 of all of the exploited vulnerabilities are way on the left here. And they're seen in less than 1 in 11,000 organizations. You are more likely to flip heads 13 times in a row than to have one device on the internet that will see these. All right. So this is a challenge. So like, you know, if you look at some of the other lists where you see like 1 to 2% of things being exploited, it could just be that they don't have a lot of devices, right, out there. They're only capturing things that they're more likely to see based on random chance, basically. And so, but it does, you know, like there are some of these that are really widespread. Again, like there are things being exploited that they spread very rapidly, but most of them do not. Most of them are dribbling. There's, you know, like I said, 3 out of 4 are detected by less than 1 in 11,000 organizations and no more. Like that is as far as they reach. Okay, how long before or after a CVE gets published that there's peak exploitation activity? And this is a little bit hard. There's a lot of, I've sort of been glossing over all of the caveats in the data, and I should be careful to say that we shouldn't believe this 100%, any of this. Like we shouldn't believe this 100%, but we also don't want to throw it out, right? We should have like pretty good belief in this, that this is reality, but there's all sorts of caveats that we can talk about, but we don't want to throw it out either. So let's talk about this peak. And one of the problems in trying to measure peak, if you remember how these things are collected, signatures are written, right? We are not going to see all of the 0 days because there's no signature for them, right? There very much could be a huge peak before publication, but we may not see it in the data, right? So if we're ignoring 0 days, which I do not suggest, but we're going to do that. So I'm going to grab some individual CVEs, and I created these sort of calendar plots to look at these. And so red, dark red, is a high volume day. There's a lot of activity going on. And then it goes into a yellowish blue, and this looks mostly gray on this projector. But what we're looking at is that thing was published in 2022. We see some darker red up front. We see more volume, more activity right away, which is what we generally intuitively think about. And it sort of continues. We get some missing data, and it sort of lightens up. And at the end of January into February, increases in volume again, lightens up. And what I like about this is that you start to see weekends are being taken off. They're blue, the top and the bottom, right? And then you get December 25th as a blue, nice holiday. January 1st over here is blue, little holiday. You know, and so we get to see this type of activity coming out in this data. Let's take a look at another one. And this one starts out in 2019. And you can see like really sporadic, like it's very bursty. So like a lot of activity gets dark red, some really dark red days with some yellow, gets some blue days. And this is not missing data from data collection. These are actually no exploitation activity being recorded. It's really sparse again up until 2022. And we don't see any more activity for it. Just stopped. And this could be maybe the attacker stopped doing it. Maybe something happened. Maybe all the signatures were removed, but we did see a day hanging out there in August with some. Here's another one. We see a lot of activity up front, sort of peters out, and then we see really sporadic, really every once in a while we're seeing some activity, and then up until the data cuts out in the beginning of 2024. Here's one more, same thing. A lot of activity up front. So we have this notion that when exploitation occurs, a lot of it is occurring up front and it sort of peters out. And that's what this is showing us, right? That's what we're seeing from this data here. Another one, a lot of activity up front. Now this one, I don't want to pick on any specific vendor, but someone published a report saying that this particular CVE that I grabbed was the #1 exploited vulnerability in 2023. Right? And the data that I have, and that might be true, by the way, like it could absolutely be true for the data they're looking at and the incidents that they responded to, this could be the #1 exploited thing. In this data that is not quite what I'm seeing, we see sort of mid-level volume that dies out pretty quick, and that's what we're seeing. This is the #2 exploited vulnerability, very sporadic, a little bursty. We get some busier days, some not so busy days. And so I was wondering, like, if those are the top two, what do I think the most exploited CVE looks like? What does that look like in this data? And it looks like this. So this is a whole lot of volume every single day, clearly one of the top ones. So using this data, what I tried to do is I set a threshold. So behind these shaded regions is basically a number between 0 and 1. And I just made a cutoff at like 0.5. And I said, how many, like for CVEs that are a day old, how many of those are above that threshold of volume? And I created this chart. And what's interesting is like you can see when something is published, and this could be two things. So we start out relatively low when something is published, and those individual dots are individual days, but then that trend line is trying to show what's going on. But we see it sort of pick up, and this could be that attackers are a little bit slow in some cases. Could be that signature writers are slow, right? Not 100% sure what's going on there, but we do see a peak just beyond 1 year. 1 year after a CV is published is when we're seeing our peak volume across these. And it goes out to the 7, 8 years that we have data. All right, another way we could look at this, another way we could try to measure when is peak exploitation activity happening is to look at all of our exploitation activity and say, all right, we saw this exploitation activity going after the CVE on this date. How old was that CVE? What was the age of that CVE on the date that we saw exploitation activity? And we get this plot. Now we are seeing a whole bunch of activity before publication, and those are probably reserved but public CVEs, right? These are CVEs where somebody goes and reserves a CVE, they write a blog post and they make a big stink. We get Metasploit exploits, we get exploit DB happening, people are talking about it, and the CVE is not published. 12 years later, it gets published, and that's when it triggers this line, right? So, and that's what we're seeing. There's, I don't know, there's several hundred of these, so thousands. Quite a lot of those reserved but public. But the important thing is on the exploit activity, we see this sort of hump in the beginning, drops down, and then we see another hump 10 to 14 years. Now, I've created this plot several times over the last few years, and I've noticed as I was doing this that these humps were moving, right? Like when I did this 2 years ago, the hump was 2 years to the left. And that made me think, and so we're gonna cover that a little bit later, but just keep that in mind for now. Now, the other thing is just looking at exploitation activity, but we know that the number of CVEs that you can target that are 20 years old is much different. 20 years ago, how many CVEs were there versus how many are being published now? And so to combat that, I normalized it by how many CVEs could be exploited in the first year, second year. And we're seeing this gradual increase by the percent of published CVEs. So according to this, peak exploitation activity is happening 12 to 14 years after publication. I don't know if I believe it. This might be a weird way to look at it, but this is what we're seeing. This is what the data is telling us, that there's, and we know this, for anybody who's looked at exploit data, there's a ton of exploitation activity for insanely old vulnerabilities. And it doesn't even make sense. And there's things trying to exploit Windows 95 on a daily basis, and it's crazy to me. All right. So just a real quick one, how much of the exploitation activity occurs in the first year? This is a very simple plot. Just looking at that exploitation activity, roughly about 10%. Less than 10% of all exploitation activity is targeting vulnerabilities in their first year of publication. Again, like we're seeing a ton of exploitation activity for the old vulnerabilities. And there was a great paper, and I can't remember the author, it might have been Fabio out of Italy, but he talks about the work-averse attacker, right? Which is a really polite way to say that attackers are lazy just like the rest of us, right? They find something to exploit, and they exploit it until it doesn't work as well as it once did, and then they update. They are not sitting there generally waiting for that new one today, and they're going to swap it out. They're going to spend the time to write the exploit for that one. And as soon as the next shiny thing comes out, that they're going to write one for that, right? They are not doing that generally, a lot of them. And what we see is that they generally use them until they don't work, and then they try to find something new. And it'll come out in the data as we look at this. All right, the last one, let's just talk about what this looks like. So this is a plot of the exploitation activity. If you remember, we had like the two bumps, and I said that they were moving through time. This is back at January of 2017. In January of 2017, this is what the exploitation activity looked like. They were targeting these. Here's that hump. Now it's at like 9, 9.5, 10, that hump there. And you see that little hump in the beginning. This is an animation. This is gonna play through the time, and we're gonna see some things happening in this. So if we knew that they didn't really target new things and they only targeted old things, it might sort of stay like this over time. We're going to play this and look at these over here in the far left. They're like bumping up, and because we're moving through forward time, it looks like this little thing pushing pins up. And it's the same thing over here. And now we're seeing these peaks move through time as the clock is ticking away. We see a big peak here. Something occurred. This peak is now going to keep moving through, and that creates that first hump that we saw in the overall plot. And it just keeps on going through. And we're going to see some things try to create a new peak here as it starts to push up. All of these peaks are moving through still, right? And we're keep on pushing older and older vulns come into play. And it just keeps pushing through. So this, to me, also is supporting that notion of this work-averse attacker, right? They keep on, and I can play this again because it's pretty great to watch. But we see this peaks, the peaks just keep traveling. So there's, these are the number of CVEs. So like there's 200 CVEs from 10 years ago or so, and they keep exploiting them, the same CVEs. Maybe they're trying a few new ones, going through, but largely they just keep doing that. And that's why the humps are moving like this. They're moving through time. Are you getting a video of this, Melissa? But that's what we're seeing. We're seeing these things, they're jitting around because we get, very bursty exploitation activity, but they're moving through time. All right. Now, if we want to take this one step further, we can look at another way of looking at this. So this is date going across the bottom, and then when was the CVE going across the top? Now, if we're seeing the work-averse attacker, what we're going to see is a CVE, this is when the CVE was published, we're going to see lines going across because they're going to follow one CVE and just go after it. And this is what we see. And you can see when we see things like this, the verticals, this is bursty traffic, right? And we're going through time. We keep on adding more CVEs. We see little bursty things being recorded here. And we're adding more and more CVEs, but these lines are staying static, right? They keep on going after these same ones. We're getting the same lines going across, and we keep on adding new ones. We get some data collection problems, and it goes through. But by and large, we're getting little bursts of exploitation activity. We're getting the same CVEs being exploited over time. All right. So to answer all of these questions, we're going to go through them now. In this data, we saw about more than 6% of published CVEs. That's how many CVEs are being exploited in the wild in this data set. We're going to see different slices of that. Which vendors have more? We called out the efficiency, this notion of efficiency. When you look at something like what proportion from a vendor has exploitation activity. And then the best indicator of exploitation in the wild, again, with bias, I think EPSS does really good at trying to predict that. True or false, once exploited in the wild, always exploited in the wild. False, mostly, right? Because it is a huge distribution. We do see things drop off. We do see things constantly exploited, right? It's very much a continuum. And part of the challenge is, I think as consumers, as people in this industry, we want to push back. And if somebody says this is exploited in the wild, we want to say when? Was it today? Was it yesterday? Was it the day before? Right? Is it still being exploited? Can you let me know in a week? Right? Because I think what we're seeing is that we see these vendors and working in EPSS and working with a lot of data, a lot of companies have different quality of data collection and different priorities in their data collection. And I'm very, very dubious when a vendor or another company says we're seeing exploitation activity, because we don't know if they have a bunch of sensors out there where they're reporting the current data from a primary source that they're looking at, or did they just finish reading a blog post that was written a week ago where somebody else claimed that I was seeing exploitation activity. And so they said, hey, yeah, this is being exploited. Yes or no? Yes, it's being exploited. Without any notion of today or yesterday or a month ago, year ago, or still. And so once exploited in the wild, always exploited in the wild is false. Like, I can't believe that it's true all the time. It is true in some cases, but mostly false, partially false. Once exploited, the spread of this is generally not in hours or minutes, right? 3 out of 4 relatively not spread out. And if you only have a handful of sensors on the internet, you may not even see those with exploitation activity because they are so sparse. How long before or after a CV publication has peak exploitation activity? Again, this is hard to nail down. We tried to measure it. I tried 3 different ways to measure it, and they all had different answers because data is just mumbles like that. But anywhere from like in the first year, after the first year, up to 10 years. But the interesting thing is that none of it was explosive. We did see like a handful of CVEs that popped that animation up around that date. So there are 0 days, there are things like that, but peak exploitation activity, I think, comes a little bit later in the life of CVEs. How long or how much of the exploitation activity occurs in the first year? Less than 10%. And in the last animations, we saw that evidence for the work-averse attacker. And with that, I can open up for questions. And if I didn't fry all of your brains with all of the numbers and data viz, I can definitely take questions. What does it say about the 0 days? So they're not actually excluded, they're missing, right? We don't have them. And a lot of the question I see is like when people talk about 0 days, where are they getting their data, right? Because in order to understand a 0 day, you have to observe it, you have to know it exists to observe it, and you have to have something out in the world to observe it with. So like, we know that 0 days exist, we know that they're exploited. How much? What sort of a priority do they get? I have no idea. I don't have the data. I have no idea. We know they're occurring. We know they're out there, but how much we don't know.
Hi, thank you very much. I have a question as to whether or not geographic region and potential sector is also included. Especially you were talking about Windows 95. I mean, with some economically challenged geographic regions, right? They may also not have the ability to be able to remediate and mitigate.
Right. Yes. So there was a lot in that. So geographic region and industry, we don't see a ton, but we do see it. Again, it's like maybe the majority, we don't see a ton of variation. I think broad geographic differences, I think we see some. We've done some research where we looked at different malware strains, and we did see different malware strains with more volume, more emphasis in different regions than others. But when you're talking about sort of the internet is, of course, very flat. Like you can reach anywhere in the internet immediately. And so I think a lot of the activity is not going to see a difference, especially like a lot of the opportunistic scanning that this is probably catching. There's not a lot of targeting of industry, but there is targeting of industry, there is targeting of regions, and especially some of the third world countries where maybe all the Windows 95 machines are shipped, you know, and they can't patch it. The end of life stuff, I think, is really interesting and a really rich thing to pursue. We did see, as soon as some of the old devices become end of life, we looked at remediation of Windows machines, and things that were end of life just like almost stopped remediating completely. Even though things that had patches still stopped patching. And so we saw that remediation really slow down for end of life. So this data, by the way, this data did not have any region or industry associated with it. And sometimes when you're collecting exploitation activity, it might just be a honeypot on a blank IP address on the internet. And so there's no industry to associate with that. It's just catching traffic. But it does have a region. But this data didn't have that, so I couldn't study that. So, yeah. Jono.
Thanks, Jay. Great as always. Since some of these CVEs are associated with a device, some of them are maybe libraries where it was much harder to do this. But is it a possible research goal to like normalize for maybe the total population of devices, or to normalize for, we know this is a thing people run in honeypots because like the HoneyNet project publishes its honeypots.
Yeah.
Or some of these other ways to dig out some of these correlations that might be related to the patterns.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and paraphrase what you said, see if I get it right. Trying to know, so like things targeting Advantech, for example, is this device, it's an IoT device. And the question is like, is the exploitation activity sort of relative to the targets, the number of targets? Yeah, I mean, I would say yes, but I haven't looked at it. And that's one of the things hopefully in EPSS we can start to do, because when one of the data sets that we're going to be getting from Cisco is vulnerable devices that we're seeing. And so now that we could see the population of vulnerable devices, and hopefully over time, we might be able to say, hey, when this CV was published, we had, 3 billion vulnerable devices in that first month. And then we saw those being remediated, and they're remediated faster because it's Microsoft. And then we saw exploitation activity sort of peter out or something like that. I don't know. It makes sense that if there's a large source of food, that's where the predators are going to go. And so obviously more popular targets are more likely to be exploited in theory. But like I said, data can be humbling. So like, yes, it should be, right? And that's a great testable thing to go after. Yeah. So.
The signatures that you're using to detect the exploits, are they looking at successful exploits or
Nope.
just attempted?
Attempted. Yeah. And so these are from all the vendors. And so one of the things that I have to do in my data is trust that they know that what they're doing. So there might be false positives in there. There might be, but as far as I know, none of them, I think, especially with Fortinet, they actually block a lot of them. So they see this exploitation activity and block it, and it will not pass through. But there's no indication that there is a vulnerable system there or not, or that they're actually targeting something that's vulnerable. No idea. It's just capturing the activity of exploitation attempts.
Hey, very cool analysis. How much do you think the type of data sources biases the result? So
Lot.
like, you know, the sort of things that you can detect via some network sensor that you would want to actually, or that you can feasibly write a rule for that the typical customers of an IDS tend to care about, and so on.
Right. So the bias in the data sources. So there is no such thing as an unbiased data source, right? I mean, like everything has bias, and a lot of these have network bias. And I mean, the only good news there is that probably the majority of vulnerabilities are network-based exploitation attempts, right? And so we're probably catching the majority. And if you look at all the technology that we use to block things, a lot of it is network-based blocking, right? And then, but if you get on the endpoint, I think that's where we're going to try and expand. So we're talking to a couple people that have EDR type solutions where they're recording that. But yes, there's bias in the data, and it is a huge problem. So all of this is actually called a convenience sample, because we're grabbing the data that we can conveniently get. This is not a random sample or random trial or anything. We're just trying to conveniently get all the data that we can get. And so yes, they have bias, and it is geared towards network. But luckily, I think most of them are network-based vulnerabilities. So hopefully we can expand that. And then the other thing is, like, if you're not looking at the data, like, again, like, what are people looking at to say there are things non-network based being exploited? Like, how do they know that? And if they do know that, I want to talk to them, because maybe they would share the data for research purposes, you know? Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge with a network bias. Josh?
Well, no, I was going to say we're just about out of time. Thank you, Jay, for this fantastic talk.